Buenas noches, me llamo David Stevenson. Oh, good evening, this is Progressive Soup. I'm David Stevenson. Tonight I have three guests that are Puerto Ricans, and I'll let them talk about what that means. We're going to talk about what differentiates between a Hispanic and a Latino, and a lot of other things we have to talk about. First of all, I'll let all three of them introduce themselves, starting with Hector Lopez.
In English, right? My name is Hector Lopez. I live in Connecticut, but I also live in Puerto Rico, mentally speaking.
Your heart's there?
My heart is in Puerto Rico, of course, and my heart is also with the fight of the people of the United States for their freedom.
And that's not limited, obviously, to Puerto Ricans. It's limited. It's expanded to all Americans in every walk of life.
Yeah, that's right. All Americans, and also the Americans from Latin America and Canada.
Okay, Olga Sanabria.
Hi. Good evening to everyone, especially to David. Thank you for having me tonight. Join the other two gentlemen that were in the program the last time you talked about Puerto Rico. I was born in Puerto Rico. I've been involved in Puerto Rican issues in the United States, especially New York, for a very long time, and I'm also involved in the Puerto Rico decolonization issue because of the colonial status.
And Daniel Vila.
David, thank you so much for inviting us. And in New York City, I work with the CISA-PACARI Labor Committee and also with the International Migrants Association Alliance, International Migrants Alliance.
Excellent. First of all, we hear the word Latino and we hear the word Hispanic. Compare, contrast, how are they similar, how are they different? Why do we use two different words?
When you use the word Latino and Hispanic, first of all, you're referring to the same group of people. That is, people in the United States that have a background from the Latin American or Caribbean countries, especially the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. One term has a more sort of like regressive, conservative connotation, which is the term Hispanic. And what's discussed in that regard is that Hispanic tends to revert the condition of Latinos in the United States to their colonial status under Spain.
So it's sort of a derogatory word.
In a way, not everyone really interprets it that way because not everyone is really conscious of the polemic about the two terms. On the other hand, if you use the term Latino or Latina, it's reverting to the place of origin, which is predominantly Latin America. Because even though oftentimes we refer to Latin America and the Caribbean, it's understood that if you say Latino, it includes Caribbeans, especially the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. So there is a polemic as to which of the two to use. The other aspect of the polemic is that it tends to be that the term Hispanic is more used by institutions with power, right? So there's sort of like a power implication to the use Hispanic. Who defines, right? So for example, the United States Census, I would say, has a little bit of power, a lot of power, refers to Latinos as Hispanics in terms of identification of the people who were being asked about their reality, taking the census of. So that's an example of how the power structure tends to use the term Hispanic. But there's another term, which is Latino, that tends to be sort of like a little bit more progressive. Usually you don't hear about Hispanic struggles, etc. Usually the term Latino is used when you talk about struggles of Latinos for more empowerment in the United States. And one interesting, maybe a little bit different, but for example, you never hear Jennifer Lopez, for example, referred to as a Hispanic. I've never heard that. You always hear it as Latina. And I think that sort of reverts to the attempt in recent years to zero in on that Latino market because of the growing Latino population in the United States. So, of course, figures like Jennifer Lopez are projected, etc. And it's interesting to me, I've taken notice that she's usually referred to as a Latina, not as a Hispanic. What that has to do with the power relationship and the use of one or the other word, I'm not sure. But it generally, the term Latino is more associated to different struggles, etc. And again, it really does more reflect the Latino reality as coming from Latin America, whereas the term Hispanic reverts to the colonial reality. The other last thing that I would like to say about this is that even the word Latino, there are some persons that also say that the word Latino is also somewhat exclusive, because the term Latino does not necessarily include the indigenous populations of Latin America. And also it doesn't include necessarily the Afro-descendant populations in Latin America, which are very large.
And of course, all the slave trade to North America came through Central America, so that's...
And the Caribbean.
There's quite a bit of, over hundreds of years, quite a bit of mixing of the races there, as well as throughout all America. We know that from the last presidential election that, genetically speaking, President Barack Obama is, I think, third cousin twice removed to Dick Cheney. There's a common DNA factor there, so they're relatives, albeit distant relatives. Now, the poet in me and the linguist in me hears the words Latino and the word Hispanic, and Latino automatically sounds better to me. It sounds softer and nicer and friendlier to me than his, which has that kind of from a poetic point of view, has kind of a dissonant sound to it, whereas Latino has the nice smoothness to it, and it just sounds friendlier.
And in addition to what you said, and Olga has said also, which I think it's all correct, I would also add that Latino sort of like throws a line, and it does separate the people born in Spain, for example, from people born in Latin America. Whether or not you're born in Latin America or in the United States of Latino origin, it does separate those in this hemisphere from those who are from Spain. And in terms of the most Latinos, that's very important, because we still see, even in Puerto Rico, we still see Spain as a country which invaded all of the Americas and had a horrible colonial. Of course, people living in Spain today are not responsible for that, but in the historical memory of the people, you want to kind of separate and make a distinction.
Which is why I guess a lot of people, when they hear other people celebrating Columbus Day, Columbus, an Italian Jew who sailed for Spain, is to a lot of people a heroic figure, but I guess there were a lot of bad things that evolved out of Columbus's first and second visit to the New World.
Oh, it's like if you could imagine perhaps somebody from the Cherokee going to Britain or Ireland and then taking the Cherokee flag or banner and putting it into the ground of England or Germany or whatever, and saying, this piece of turf belongs to the Cherokee. It's the same thing, of course. I think people today could understand this. Yes, that we're sort of like trapped in the events which our ancestors, the crimes that many of the ancestors committed. But I think today we're all coming to a conclusion that definitely the way history was taught to us and the way it appears in many books is not the correct history. And I think many of the things that are taking place right now in New York City, for example, across the country in terms of Occupy Wall Street and all the mass consciousness that is going on in terms of the 99% versus the 1%, I think people are reaching a new consciousness in terms of the need to rewrite our history in this country.
I think it's safe to say that we all are united in the concept that nobody wants to be invaded. Nobody wants to have their territory captured, taken over, and occupied by any foreign country or any foreign people. Or really, in fact, you see within the same countries where you have, I'm Irish, and you saw the battles between the Irish Catholics and the Irish Protestants, which of course was pretty much manipulated by Great Britain, because they figured if they could have the Catholics and the Protestants fighting against one another, it made it a lot less likely that the two groups, the Catholics and the Protestants, would recognize that actually was the British government that was responsible for most everything bad that happened in Ireland. True. Now, where do Puerto Ricans fit in to the political scenery nowadays? There's obviously a lot of different Latino groups, and you can talk about different Latino groups and where they compare and contrast one to the other, how they're alike, how they're different, what their common goals are, what their common bonds are, both from the Puerto Rican aspect, from the Puerto Rican point of view. Where are we politically as a country? There's a lot to talk about, but let's try it.
Trying to be a little bit brief and to the point on that, I think one great distinction between, we mentioned at the beginning Latinos, but of course each Latino has an ethnicity within that great nation called a Latino nation or whatever. And Puerto Ricans, one thing that distinguishes us from all other Latinos is that that have migrated to the United States is that Puerto Ricans, from the moment they're born, even in Puerto Rico, you're an American citizen. And this is a result of the United States occupation of Puerto Rico beginning in 1888, which continues up until the day of today. And we could talk a little bit more detail.
About the time of the Spanish-American War.
Exactly. And we could talk a little bit more about that later on. But, you know, for many of us, for most people in Puerto Rico is still an occupied country. Even people that favor statehood for Puerto Rico, for example, recognize that Puerto Rico is an occupied country, a colonized country, and they would like to have some type of a solution to that colonial status. But in any case, here in the United States, Puerto Ricans are different in the sense that we're already American citizens, so we don't have to fight for the right to vote. And of course, probably, you know, I think it's safe to say that at least in the eastern, because the eastern coast is different from the west coast, where there you have Chicanos or Mexicans of Mexican Americans of Mexican descent. They're the overwhelming. We're talking about around 15 to 20 million Chicanos. But on the east coast, at least, Puerto Ricans definitely are already American citizens, and so, you know, a majority of Puerto Ricans exercise that right.
Regarding this, the question of Puerto Ricans in relation to the Latino population in the United States, I think first of all that Puerto Ricans in the United States have very common interests with the rest of the Latino population in the United States, which it's a part of. But I might also add that there are also differences that sort of like distinguish the Puerto Rican population, which I don't mean in a hierarchical way in any sense. First of all, the Puerto Ricans were the second massive migration to the United States after Mexicans and after Cubans. But in relation to the Cuban population, it was much more massive, right? So that's one thing that's different besides what Daniel already said about Puerto Ricans being born citizens. The other aspect that I think is important is that Puerto Rican migration to the United States began from the moment of the United States invasion. But there was also a population here before the invasion, especially in New York City. It was a very small population, but it was here. Later in the early 20s, there was also a migration because of the economic transformations that took place in Puerto Rico after the United States invaded. And in the late 1940s and 1950s, and we're talking about 60 years ago, was the really huge Puerto Rican migration, which was 500,000 people during that decade migrated to the United States.
And of course, a lot of them, as we know, settled in New York City.
Many of them in New York, but also in the Midwest, also in New England, also in New Jersey, also in Philadelphia. There's also a small population from the 19th century in New Orleans, San Francisco, and also Los Angeles. But my point about the massive migration of the late 40s and 50s, that was the huge migration. And one of the things that we should know is that that's 60 years ago. And even though it's 60 years ago, Puerto Ricans in the United States continue to have huge social, economic problems. Puerto Ricans right now are the group with the lowest social indicators, except for Native Americans, as a group. There was a recent study by the New York Community Society, which established that Puerto Rican youth from 18 to 24 years of age in New York City have the lowest social indicators. The other point that I would make...
They're less socialized into the generic culture?
I would say that's true. I would say that's true.
The economic indicators we're talking about?
Yes. The other point is that on the one hand, that shouldn't be that way because it's 60 years of being in the United States. Now, the other aspect that I would bring, that I would like to refer to, is the fact that Puerto Ricans, as the second largest Latino minority after Mexican Americans and Mexicans, which have different origins to their population in the United States.
Yes.
Puerto Ricans, as that second largest minority, Latino minority, and the presence here for more than 60 years, have been pioneers for other Latino groups. That is to say that the struggles that Puerto Ricans have waged in the United States created quite a number of social, civic institutions and experience that have later been used when the Latino migration to the United States increased tremendously in the last 20 or 25 years in the United States. So that's also a role that Puerto Ricans have played that I think deserves to also be mentioned. The last thing that I would like to mention about the relationship of Puerto Ricans to Latinos and the Puerto Rican reality in general in the United States is that despite our reality, all these different points that I've tried to make, Puerto Ricans are sort of like invisible in the United States. There isn't much public debate or public information in the newspapers, the mainland, the mainstream media, be it television, electronic, the newspapers, radio. And my opinion about this is, first of all, it's lamentable, of course, and because of our history in this country. But I think the root of it, even though there might be a couple of different factors, I think the most important root of it is the fact that Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. And that to the degree that Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, especially Puerto Ricans in the United States, were to be in the public debate, the colonial issue is bound to also be in the public debate because it's part and parcel of the Puerto Rican reality, including the Puerto Rican reality in the United States. And if that reality comes to the fore, then the United States violations of Puerto Rican rights, Puerto Rican human rights included in Puerto Rico, would come to the fore. And that's something, and the United States violation of international law by maintaining a colony in the Caribbean would also come to the fore. So it's incumbent for the powers that be that the issue of Puerto Ricans in the United States and their history, their reality, their contributions be kept as quiet as possible, even though sometimes it's difficult. I mean, now Puerto Ricans have a member of the Supreme Court. It's not that she belongs to us, but she's Puerto Rican, and she's a member of the United States Supreme Court. But I think that's one of the factors that has to do with this sort of like invisibility of Puerto Ricans in the United States, which I think is really very unfortunate.
When Hector and Daniel came to visit Progressive Soup nearly 2 years ago, it seems much more recently than that, it's been nearly 2 years, we spent a whole show practically talking about options for the island of Puerto Rico. We talked about, of course, you mentioned the option of independence, the option of statehood, and the option of
the present status.
The present status of that of essentially a colony of the United States. Did you want to touch on that, Hector?
Well, I would say that statehood doesn't apply to Puerto Rico because, you see, when settlers from the original 13 colonies, after they gained their independence, went to other territories and pushed the Indians or wiped out the Indians, or Native Americans, I should say, away from the land, then they built cities and towns, and they asked their country to accept them into statehood. We are not settlers. We are not descendants of settlers from the United States. We are a distinct people with a different ethnic background in many ways. So statehood is not something that applies to the Puerto Rican people. We are a Latin American nation under the military occupation of a foreign power that has a complete different culture, a complete different language, and for that reason I say that statehood should not even be an issue about Puerto Rico. Should not be an issue. The only issues that are fit for the Puerto Rican nation is independence. And if after we're independent, then we can choose as to whether we want to join blocks of nations, for example, the block of nations that's forming in Latin America, or if we want to join another block of nations, but provided that there is a clause in the constitution or whatever of those blocks of nations that let us escape that union if we choose.
You know, David, there is the last time we came here, this was not on the table, but under pro-statehood Governor Luis Fortuño, there is a new proposal to push for a plebiscite. And people in Puerto Rico just love to go to elections. It's like a party time, right, and festival and so on and so forth. And so the new proposal of the statehood government is that there be a two-part plebiscite. The first part.
Explain to that because
Yeah.
because I'm a little hazy on that, as I'm sure many of the members of the audience are. Describe what a plebiscite is.
Well, it was very confusing also for most of the Puerto Rican population, and it still is, because this idea has been played with quite a bit over the last couple of years. But apparently, the final consensus is that there will be two-part plebiscite. In the first part, later on this year, supposedly, people would vote on whether or not they want to continue with the present status and the present relationship with the United States. Depending upon that vote, that is, if the vote says overwhelmingly, or the majority says, yes, we want to continue with no other plebiscite. If the majority say, no, we do not want to continue with this present relationship with the United States, then there will be a second plebiscite next year where people will be asked if they want to opt for statehood, for independence, or for what is being called an improvement in the present so-called free associated state. And this is very controversial in Puerto Rico again, because even the people that favor the present status, which we consider, the three of us at least consider to be a colonial status, the people that would favor that status don't want the definition which the present statehood government wants to impose on the people in favor of that status. But I should add one thing, David, I'm sorry, and that is that for most of us that favor independence, independence will not be achieved through the ballot box. We are familiar, for example, I at least go along more along the line of thinking of George Washington. Mm-hmm. And George Washington, of course, didn't ask the British, listen, we want to vote on whether or not we want to continue being a colony.
Essentially a revolutionary.
Sure, and that's very insulting. Do you want to continue being a colony, or do you want to have your independence? And the people of Puerto Rico will never achieve independence through the ballot box, because for the simple reason that, for example, all the media, the newspapers, the TV, all the school, all the institutions are controlled totally by the colonial power. As long as we have a colonial power controlling everything, people cannot vote freely. That's why one of the demands of truly independent forces is that for there to be a true democratic election on status, that people have to, the United States has to first remove itself from the scene for a period of time and let the Puerto Rican people then decide on their own what they really want to have decided.
I think one of the
Okay. No, I was going to say that elections held under military occupation are null and void according to international law and the UN Charter. So we have no free elections. It's a sham. It's a big lie.
I think one of the issues that also come to bear when we talk about plebiscites in Puerto Rico is, of course, you can't have a plebiscite where people can really, truly, freely choose an option. If there have been 100 years of economic dependence, 100 years of the development of a colonial mentality, and 100 years of a huge disproportionate relationship of power between the United States and Puerto Rico, which is what has been the reality. Now, regarding the present discussion on plebiscite, of course, the present governing party, they're the ones that have a consensus. It's not a consensus of the Puerto Rican people. It's a consensus of the governing party that wants to push this through because they support statehood and they're going to take advantage of the power they have to carry out a plebiscite where their option is going to come out winning. And they're going to use the power they have within the government apparatus for that purpose. In this regard, I think it's important also to take into account that one of the aspects of the Puerto Rican movement for independence decolonization and independence is that for a long time we've maintained that any process of consultation of the Puerto Rican people would have to take place under international law.
So it would be an internationally monitored election, like you've seen in many countries where you've been monitors from many countries to observe and note whether the election is a freely run election.
Right, but it's not just about observers and whether or not it's free or there's corruption or there are votes that are stolen, etc. It's also about following international law regarding a consultation of people that have been under colonial rule. Because it's understood that colonial rule has results that affect the way people vote because of the dependence, because of the colonial mentality, because of the control that Daniel mentioned, under which the media in the country have also functioned. So you have to take measures that counteract that reality before people can really freely choose or come close to choosing freely. Now, under international law, for example, in a plebiscite that would be legitimate under international law, you would have to first of all determine who participates in that consultation. It's understood that Puerto Rico does not control its borders. It's the United States Immigration Service and the Department of State that determines who goes into Puerto Rico, who migrates in Puerto Rico, who lives in Puerto Rico. And we have a huge
we're going to have to break it off right there. We'll come back and do a second show, but I just want to make a note of when you gentlemen were here nearly 2 years ago, we spent some of our time talking about the influence of Walmart and all the major big box stores within the country of Puerto Rico, the same way that Americans on mainland America have been browbeaten for decades by corporations and multinational conglomerates like Walmart. Same thing in Puerto Rico. You've been inundated with this corporate mentality of big stores coming in and wiping out small,
economic interests,
small mom and pop businesses.
There you go.
Okay, we're going to come back and talk about those again in a couple of minutes for the miracle of modern television. But for now, this is David Stevenson, Progressive Soup, Hector Lopez,
Olga Sanabria,
and Daniel Vila. Thank you very much. We'll be back in a few minutes. Thanks. Good night.